The Schism of 1054, a watershed moment in Christian history, marked the definitive division between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. This split, rooted in complex theological, political, and cultural disagreements, reshaped the religious landscape of Europe and had enduring global implications. Historical context preceding the schism. The seeds of division between the Eastern and Western Christian traditions were sown long before the formal split of 1054. To understand the Great Schism, one must consider the Roman Empire's state in the centuries leading up to the schism. After Emperor Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople in 330 AD, the empire gradually divided into Eastern and Western halves. This separation was not merely administrative, but also reflected deepening cultural and linguistic divides. The East primarily spoke Greek and held to Hellenistic customs, while the West spoke Latin and was influenced by a Roman ethos. Theologically, the Christian Church had been experiencing tension and divergences in ritual and doctrine since the Council of Chalcedon in 451, which led to the first major split in the Church, the separation from the Oriental Orthodox churches. The Chalcedonian Schism was indicative of the differences in theological language and cultural expressions of faith that would later contribute to the Great Schism. The political disintegration of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century left the Bishop of Rome, later known as the Pope, in a unique position of authority, devoid of imperial oversight. Conversely, in the East, the Church remained under the Emperor's influence, who was seen as God's representative on earth. This gave rise to the concept of Caesaropapism, where the emperor had a significant say in ecclesiastical matters, contrasting sharply with the growing claims of papal supremacy in the West. The 7th and 8th centuries witnessed the iconoclasm controversy, which created further strife. The Eastern Church experienced internal conflict over the use of icons in worship, leading to a period where their veneration was banned. The Western Church, particularly the papacy, strongly supported the use of icons, causing a rift that extended beyond mere doctrinal disagreements to encompass politics and authority. Moreover, the crowning of Charlemagne as the Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day of 800 added to the growing estrangement. This act was perceived in the East as a usurpation of the title belonging rightfully to the Byzantine emperor, thus deepening the divide. Throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, several other disputes arose, including the Filioque controversy. The Western Church had unilaterally added the phrase, "and the Son," Filioque, to the Nicene Creed, asserting that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. This was not merely a theological point of contention, but also a matter of ecclesiastical authority, as the East saw this unilateral addition as a breach of the decisions made by the ecumenical councils, which were meant to be binding on all of Christendom. Political and cultural differences. The disintegration of a once unified Christian tradition into the Eastern Orthodox and Western Roman Catholic churches cannot be attributed to a single event, but rather to a series of entwined political and cultural differences that evolved over time. The political landscape of Europe and the Near East played a crucial role in the growing divide between East and West, with the Christian Church at the epicenter of these transformative times. In the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, the emperor was the unrivaled head of state, seen as God's representative on earth, with both a political and a religious function. This intertwining of imperial and ecclesiastical power, known as Caesaropapism, gave the Byzantine emperor significant influence over church affairs. The imperial court in Constantinople was characterized by a complex bureaucracy and a ceremonial system that some in the West viewed as overly elaborate and indicative of Eastern decadence. Contrastingly, the West operated under a different system following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The papacy in Rome, asserting its supremacy based on the Petrine doctrine, that the Pope is the successor to St. Peter, began to fill the vacuum of power, becoming a central figure in the West's political landscape. The Pope's claim to universal jurisdiction was a point of contention with the Eastern Church, which saw the 5 patriarchal sees, Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, as being of equal authority, with the emperor playing a pivotal role. Culturally, the East and West had been drifting apart for centuries. The Latin-speaking West, with Rome at its heart, had developed different customs, liturgical practices, and even architectural styles from the Greek-speaking East. The art, music, and liturgy of the Eastern Church were seen as mystical and symbolic, while the Western Church favored a more practical and legalistic approach to theology and church governance. The linguistic divide was more than just a communication barrier. It symbolized the divergence in theological expression and interpretation. Greek, with its philosophical precision, was suited to the East's theological discourse, while Latin's legalistic tendencies shaped Western doctrine. This difference in language and thought contributed to misunderstandings and misconceptions, with each side sometimes viewing the other's theological positions as heretical or misguided. The Western Church's addition of the Filioque clause to the Nicene Creed without the consent of an ecumenical council was not just a theological dispute, but also a cultural assertion of independence from the East. The cultural rift was exacerbated by the Carolingian Renaissance, which saw the reassertion of Roman law and classical Latin culture, further distancing it from the Byzantine tradition. Doctrinal disputes leading to the Schism. The doctrinal disputes that precipitated the Great Schism were not merely theological quibbles, but were deeply tied to issues of power, culture, and identity. The primary theological debates centered around the nature of the Holy Trinity, the authority of the Pope, and the proper way to express the Christian faith in liturgical practices. The most divisive theological argument was over the Filioque clause, an addition to the Nicene Creed. The original creed, agreed upon at the First Council of Nicaea and reaffirmed at the First Council of Constantinople, stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. However, in the West, the phrase "and the Son" was added, indicating that the Holy Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son. This insertion, which did not occur in the East, challenged the Orthodox conception of the Trinity and was seen as an unauthorized alteration of a foundational Christian text. The Eastern Church viewed the unilateral addition as an overreach of papal authority and a breach of ecclesiastical protocol, as it had been done without the consensus of an ecumenical council. Another doctrinal issue was the Western Church's use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, which the Eastern Church saw as a break from the apostolic tradition of using leavened bread. This might seem a minor point, but it was emblematic of the larger issue of whether the Western Church could make significant liturgical changes without the agreement of the Eastern Church. The concept of purgatory, while not fully developed until after the Schism, began to be articulated in the West during this time. This doctrine, which posited a state of afterlife purification before one could enter heaven, was not recognized by the Eastern Church and became yet another point of contention. Papal primacy was also a significant issue. The Pope's claim to be the vicar of Christ and the head of the Church on earth was rejected by the Eastern Church, which held to the idea of a pentarchy, where the 5 patriarchs of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem had authority over their own regions. The Eastern view was that the Pope was first among equals, a primus inter pares, rather than a supreme authority. The crowning of the Holy Roman Emperor, which the Pope in Rome undertook, was another source of tension. The Byzantine Empire saw itself as the continuation of the Roman Empire and viewed the Pope's action as an infringement on their territory and authority. The role of the papacy. At the heart of the schism between the Eastern and Western churches was the evolving role and authority of the papacy. The Bishop of Rome, later known as the Pope, had long been regarded with respect in the Christian world due to the city's historical significance as the capital of the Roman Empire and the place of martyrdom for Saints Peter and Paul. Over time, the See of Rome claimed increasing authority over Christendom, a claim grounded in the belief that the Apostle Peter was the first bishop of Rome and, as such, his successors inherited a special role in the Church. The concept of the Petrine doctrine, which asserted the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, became a central tenet of the Western Church. This doctrine was bolstered by the donation of Constantine, a document that was later shown to be a forgery, which purportedly granted the Pope secular authority over the Western Roman Empire. The papacy's claim to supremacy was not merely spiritual, but also temporal, and it began to have significant political implications, especially as the Western Church's influence expanded. In contrast, the Eastern Church, particularly the Patriarch of Constantinople, viewed the Pope as first among equals, a primus inter pares, rather than a supreme ruler over all of Christianity. The Eastern Church upheld the conciliar model of church governance, where the 5 patriarchs would come together in ecumenical councils to decide matters of doctrine and practice. The gradual drift of the papacy towards absolute authority was antithetical to this collegial approach and led to resentment and resistance in the East. The assertion of papal supremacy reached a pivotal moment with the coronation of Charlemagne as emperor by Pope Leo III. This act not only created a new political entity in the West, but also symbolized the Pope's claim to temporal power, which was a direct challenge to the Byzantine emperor's authority. The coronation was seen in the East as an overstepping of ecclesiastical boundaries and an encroachment on the Eastern emperor's jurisdiction. The Pope's authority was further emphasized through the use of titles such as Vicar of Christ, which implied a unique and universal jurisdiction. Papal legates, representatives of the Pope, often asserted his authority in ecclesiastical matters throughout Europe and beyond, sometimes clashing with local bishops and traditions. The papal claims to universal jurisdiction were bolstered by developments in canon law which sought to codify the Pope's authority and the structure of the Church. Tensions reached a high point during the reign of Pope Leo IX, whose legates to Constantinople in 1054 carried a bull of excommunication against Patriarch Michael Carolarius, who had closed Latin churches in Constantinople and rejected papal overtures. The Patriarch, in turn, excommunicated the legates, setting off a chain of events that would culminate in the mutual excommunications that marked the official schism. This confrontation was not just a personal dispute, but a manifestation of the deep-seated disagreements over the nature and extent of papal authority. Key figures in the schism. The Schism of 1054 was not merely an abstract event born out of impersonal forces. It was driven by key figures whose actions and beliefs played critical roles in the unfolding drama. These individuals, with their complex motives and convictions, personified the theological and political conflicts of their time, and through their decisions, the course of Christian history was forever altered. At the forefront was Pope Leo IX, whose papacy from 1049 to 1054 was marked by a vigorous reform agenda and an assertive stance on papal authority. Leo was determined to strengthen the Church's moral standing and centralize its administration. His dispatch of Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida to Constantinople in 1054 was pivotal. Humbert, a staunch advocate of Roman primacy and a man of uncompromising temperament, carried with him the bull of excommunication that would be laid down on the altar of the Hagia Sophia, dramatically symbolizing the severing of ties between East and West. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, was equally significant. He was a strong defender of Eastern tradition and highly critical of the Latin Church's practices, such as the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist. Cerularius's closure of Latin churches in Constantinople and his subsequent excommunication by the papal legates contributed directly to the escalation of hostilities. His opposition to Western liturgical customs and his resistance to papal overreach were emblematic of the broader Eastern stance. Another crucial figure was Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos of the Byzantine Empire, who reigned during the Schism. While he attempted to maintain diplomatic relations with the papacy, his own political troubles and the pressures from within the Byzantine Church limited his ability to prevent or resolve the schism. His role highlights the complex interplay between ecclesiastical and imperial power that characterized the Byzantine approach to church-state relations. Further back in history, but still influential, was Patriarch Photius of Constantinople, whose earlier conflict with Pope Nicholas I in the 9th century over the appointment of the Patriarch and the use of the Filioque clause set a precedent for the theological and ecclesiastical disputes that would culminate in the schism. Photius's scholarly work and defense of Eastern theology against Western modifications would echo through the centuries and help shape the contours of the eventual split, the mutual excommunications. The mutual excommunications of 1054 stand as the most emblematic event of the Great Schism, marking the official ecclesiastical rupture between the Eastern Orthodox and Western Roman Catholic churches. This momentous event was not a sudden rupture, but the culmination of long-standing theological disagreements and power struggles that had been brewing for centuries. Pope Leo IX sent a delegation to Constantinople with the aim of asserting Roman authority and addressing the various practices in the Eastern Church that the Western Church considered objectionable. The delegation was led by Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, a man known for his abrasive style and fervent advocacy for Roman primacy. Upon arrival, the legates were met with a cold reception, as the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, was already incensed by the Western Church's actions, particularly the closing of Eastern churches in southern Italy and the enforced Latinization of their liturgies. Tensions escalated quickly as Cardinal Humbert laid a bull of excommunication against Patriarch Michael Cerularius and his followers on the altar of the Hagia Sophia, the very heart of Eastern Christendom. This dramatic gesture was not merely a denunciation of the Patriarch himself, but a broader condemnation of Eastern practices and beliefs that the Western Church deemed heretical, such as the use of leavened bread in the Eucharist and the marriage of priests. The Patriarch, in turn, convened a synod in Constantinople where he excommunicated the papal legates. The counter-excommunication was a forceful affirmation of Eastern autonomy and a rejection of Western claims of supremacy. The synod's actions were a clear message that the Eastern Church would not submit to papal authority and would uphold its own traditions and practices. The excommunications were profound in their symbolism. They signified a point of no return in the schism. They underscored the depth of the divide between the two traditions and reflected the mutual intransigence and lack of understanding that characterized the relationship between East and West. It is crucial to note that the excommunications were not universally recognized immediately. Communication was slow, and the understanding of a definitive schism took time to develop across Christendom. Many in the Church hoped for reconciliation and viewed the excommunications as a temporary impasse rather than a permanent split. Nonetheless, the events of 1054 irrevocably changed the trajectory of Christian history, setting the stage for parallel developments in ecclesiastical structures, theologies, and liturgies in the East and West. Immediate aftermath and reactions. The immediate aftermath of the mutual excommunications of 1054 reverberated through the corridors of ecclesiastical power and into the daily lives of the Christian faithful. These events, while symbolizing the deep-rooted divisions between the Eastern and Western churches, did not instantly create two separate communities. The process was gradual, as the reality of the schism unfolded over subsequent decades and centuries. Initially, many Christians on both sides of the divide were unaware of the extent of the schism. The general population continued to practice their faith as before, often oblivious to the ecclesiastical politics that had led to this profound separation. For many, the schism was less an immediate rupture and more a slow dawning of separation, with changes in liturgical practices and ecclesiastical allegiances emerging over time. Among the clergy and the educated elite, however, the schism was a topic of intense debate and often bitter recrimination. In the East, the actions of the papal legates were seen as an outrageous affront to the dignity of the Eastern Church and its traditions. The excommunication of Patriarch Michael Cerularius and his subsequent response were viewed with a mix of defiance and sorrow. The hope for reconciliation lingered, but the conviction that the Eastern traditions were worth defending against Western encroachment was strong. In the West, the excommunications were similarly upheld as a necessary defense of orthodoxy and papal prerogative. The Western Church viewed the Eastern refusal to acknowledge the Pope's authority and the differences in liturgical practice as signs of deviation from the true faith. The breakdown of communion was lamented, but many also saw it as a vindication of the Western Church's stand against what it perceived as Eastern errors. The secular rulers of the time also had varied reactions. In the Byzantine Empire, the schism was another challenge to be managed, as the emperors sought to maintain the integrity of their rule in the face of both external threats and internal dissent. For the Holy Roman Emperors and other Western rulers, the schism presented both an opportunity to assert their own authority in spiritual matters and a complication in their dealings with Byzantine power. The schism's impact was felt not only in doctrinal and liturgical realms, but also in the broader cultural and intellectual life of both societies. In the West, the schism reinforced the burgeoning cultural movements that would lead to the Renaissance, as the Roman Church sought to assert its spiritual and temporal authority. In the East, the schism reinforced the Orthodox Church's role as a custodian of Hellenic Christian tradition, particularly as the Byzantine Empire faced increasing pressure from Islamic forces. Long-term religious and political implications. The Great Schism of 1054 had profound long-term implications that reshaped the religious and political landscape of Europe and beyond, setting a course for the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches that persists to this day. The split entrenched a religious divide that reflected and reinforced emerging national and cultural identities, influencing the course of history well beyond the ecclesiastical sphere. In the religious domain, the schism solidified doctrinal differences and ecclesiastical practices that had been developing for centuries. The Eastern Orthodox Church maintained its Greek liturgical tradition and its theological focus on the divine mysteries, emphasizing theosis as the process of coming into union with God. The Roman Catholic Church continued to develop its Latin Rite, characterized by a systematic theological approach that culminated in the scholastic movement and a strong emphasis on the juridical aspects of salvation and church governance. Theological education and scholarship took divergent paths. In the West, the rise of universities became a hallmark of the High Middle Ages, with theologians like Thomas Aquinas synthesizing Aristotelian philosophy and Christian doctrine. The Eastern Church, meanwhile, preserved the patristic tradition and the works of the Church Fathers, fostering a theological perspective that was less influenced by the philosophical currents that shaped the Western intellectual tradition. The schism also had significant political implications. In the West, the papacy's role in secular affairs expanded, with popes like Gregory VII and Innocent III asserting papal authority over temporal rulers. This culminated in conflicts such as the investiture controversy, where the Church sought to free itself from secular influence in the appointment of bishops. In the East, the Byzantine emperors continued to exert influence over church affairs, but the empire's declining political fortunes limited its ability to project power over the increasingly independent Orthodox churches in Eastern Europe. The religious divide influenced political alliances and conflicts. The Crusades, initially launched as a united Christian endeavor to reclaim the Holy Land, turned into a source of further estrangement, especially after the sack of Constantinople by Crusader forces in 1204. This event was a catastrophic betrayal for the Byzantines and irreparably damaged any prospect of reconciliation. The schism's cultural implications were equally significant. In the West, the Roman Catholic Church played a central role in the formation of a Western European identity that was distinct from the Orthodox Christian East. This was reflected in art, literature, and law, where Western Christendom developed its unique cultural expressions. In the Eastern Orthodox world, the Church became a bastion of cultural continuity, especially as the Byzantine Empire faced increasing threats from Islamic forces and later from the Ottoman Turks. Attempts at reconciliation. Despite the profound divisions cemented by the mutual excommunications of 1054, the subsequent centuries witnessed several attempts at reconciliation between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. These endeavors, driven by a complex interplay of theological, political, and practical considerations, reveal the enduring hope for unity within Christendom. The Second Council of Lyon in 1274 was one of the first significant efforts to heal the schism. The council, convened by Pope Gregory IX, saw a temporary union when the representatives of the Eastern Church, under the pressure of the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, accepted the primacy of the Pope. However, this union was rejected by the Orthodox clergy and laity upon the delegates' return to Constantinople, and the schism remained in place. Another major attempt took place at the Council of Ferrara, Florence in 1438 to 1439. Under the looming threat of Ottoman expansion, Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaiologos and Patriarch Joseph II sought assistance from the West, which was conditioned on ecclesiastical union. The council concluded with the Laetentur Caeli decree, proclaiming the reunion of the Eastern and Western churches. Nevertheless, much like the agreement at Lyon, The decree was met with strong opposition in the East and failed to achieve lasting unity. Throughout these negotiations, the key issues remained the papal primacy and the Filioque clause, among other doctrinal disputes. Compromise on these points was reached on paper, but the practical implications proved too great a barrier. The Eastern Church was unwilling to accept Roman supremacy and alterations to the creed without the consent of an ecumenical council that included the Eastern bishops. In addition to these formal councils, there were numerous informal dialogues and correspondences between theologians and church leaders. Such exchanges often reflected a genuine desire for unity and a mutual recognition of shared faith, despite the enduring institutional divide. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks was a cataclysmic event for the Eastern Church and momentarily shifted the geopolitical context for East-West relations. The ensuing subjugation of the Orthodox Church under Islamic rule gave new urgency to the idea of Christian unity. However, rather than bringing the churches closer together, the fall further complicated the possibility of reconciliation, as the Eastern Church struggled to maintain its identity and autonomy under Ottoman hegemony. In the modern era, the ecumenical movement has provided a new framework for dialogue. The 20th century saw renewed efforts, with both churches participating in the World Council of Churches and engaging in bilateral theological dialogues. The Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, marked a significant shift in the Roman Catholic Church's approach to ecumenism, leading to the mutual revocation of the 1054 excommunications by Pope Paul VI and Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras in 1965.